afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 7th session in our 2020 School Law Conference. I'm Kendra Yak, and I am excited to welcome you today. For those of you who have been with us for the past almost 30 years, you know that each year we host an annual School Law Conference for clients and friends. We're always excited to be in Oak Brook with hundreds of you for sessions on all the school law topics on your mind. This year, unfortunately, we're not able to be together, but we are happy to use this Thursday time slot to bring you the sessions we otherwise would have presented at the School Law Conference. This conference is being held on Thursdays at noon every week between October 1st and December 3rd with a break for Thanksgiving. I'm happy to welcome our panel today, Jennifer Smith and Dana Crumley. Before we begin, I do want to flag for you that next week's session will be November 19th, also at noon. It's called Property Taxes and Assessments, Protecting Revenues and Communicating Effectively. This session will focus on how the largest revenue source for school districts has been affected by the events of 2020, as well as provide effective ways for administrators and board members to communicate the impact of these changes to stakeholders and community members. Registration will be sent to you after today's webinar, or you can find it on the website under events. While you're there, don't forget to check out our many alerts, blogs, podcasts, and webinars that we've hosted over the past year and will continue to do as we go through this difficult time. If any of your colleagues are not able to join us today, or if you want to review this presentation later, the recordings are also on the website. You can also find them on our YouTube channel and on our Education Law Insights podcast. Please submit your questions today using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will do our best to answer them. As always, if you have any follow-up questions or would like to discuss any of the issues that we talk about today, please reach out to any of us or any of the other forensic attorneys. All right, here we are, you know us, and I'll let Jennifer kind of give you a rundown of our top 10 topics today.
Sure. So we're going to go fast, and we tried to pull out the issues we've gotten the most questions about. So I won't read them to you, but we're going to go through each of these. Please, you can go ahead and ask questions in the chat if you have questions you want us to address when we get to one of these, but know that these are on the way. So.
Okay, so let's jump right into remote learning plans. And we've been talking about these since the spring. I know districts across the state have done this differently. Districts across the country have done this differently. But we have seen that writing out a remote learning plan is really helpful. And what the remote learning plan does is it outlines how the student's IEP is going to be implemented during remote learning and during hybrid learning. And I think it is possible to write it in a way so that you don't have to rewrite it every time you shift from remote to hybrid to in-person back to remote, or to have that flexibility and those contingencies sort of built in so the team doesn't have to keep revisiting it. We do recommend that you incorporate it into the IEP via an amendment. So it's not going to change the services the student would receive in person, but it becomes part of that IEP so that when we look at what the district is legally obligated to provide, we're looking to that remote plan during the times that you're doing remote learning. And I think that's really critical because as we've started to see due process cases come in, state complaints come in, failure to implement is the top issue. Far and away, that is the thing most that parents are complaining about and that hearing officers are finding is denying kids FAPE if that IEP is not being implemented. So having a remote plan, it gives you that clear communication. It forces your team to really put to paper, what are we gonna do, and get parents on board with that, have it documented, make sure you're doing what it says on paper and vice versa. And then it also, you know, because it's incorporated into the IEP, gives parents their procedural safeguards. So that doesn't mean parents can challenge, I don't think it's okay for the school district to be remote. They can't challenge that piece. What they can challenge is when we're remote, I think my student needs this additional service. And so that's the type of thing that the IEP team should be working through. Jennifer and Dana, have you guys had experiences with these plans?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the main concern I've heard is just exhaustion with all the different changes and Do we need to change again? You know, we might do a pause here over the break. What does that mean for our remote learning plans? And I mean, the legal and, you know, from a legal liability perspective, the closer the paperwork is to what you're actually doing, the stronger your legal position. Now, I'm also a pragmatist, and there are times when it's just not realistic to redo or update. But certainly if we were to start fresh, I would say you want your remote learning plan to be as flexible and include as many possible scenarios as you might utilize as a district, so that you're not redoing them again and again, and they have applicability whether you're hybrid, remote, in person, but reduced schedule maybe. So now that's really hard to do because you don't have a crystal ball and don't maybe know even what all the options your district might be implementing over the year. But that's the one thing I would say at this point in the year, I'm just getting frustration about, okay, we actually did them at the beginning of the year, but now things are changing again.
Right, and I think the other key piece to it is you have to be a pragmatist. You have to do what's able to be done in the amount of time you've allotted. But you also need to encourage staff that it's not just about like creating this big, huge document. It's also about being flexible and documenting how you're being flexible to provide service. And that means just sort of making sure your everyday communications with parents are documented in some way, shape, or form, whether it's a quick email, because that can also help provide defense if there's questions later, just that everyday good communication between home and school.
Yeah, I think this situation has really emphasized how critical that communication piece is. Parents, you know, get very frustrated. We get a lot of complaints when they just don't know what to expect. And, you know, the world is kind of upside down right now and nobody really knows what to expect. So to the extent that you can give some concrete information to parents about this is what the educational day is going to look like for your student, that can calm a lot of fears and help you out.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about remote learning plans. As Kendra said, the biggest problem that we're seeing right now with complaints, or the biggest issue that comes up for complaints that we see, is failure to implement. So failure to implement, if you don't, this is why it is worth the work of doing a remote learning plan. IEPs, as they're written for in-person instruction, in some cases, you're just going to apply them the same way. So if you have a student that is getting resource minutes pretty much only and is meeting with a special ed teacher and then going to class the rest of the time, maybe his or her IEP is not going to look much different when you're in the remote setting. It's just that services are going to be provided remotely. But if you have students that are, you know, walking around the building with a physical therapist, going up and down stairs, doing a lot of experiential things, hand over hand or with staff, you are going to need to change that plan because there's no way it can be implemented if the student's at home. So that's sort of your best defense to any claims, is to change the plan and to change the services so that they're still meaningful. I think the other important thing to remember is that the FAPE obligation continues. We've really, you know, for better or for worse, and to use the overused phrase, it is what it is, the Department of Education has not given any relaxation of the requirement to provide FAPE to students. They have to be receiving, students have to be receiving educational benefit, whether you're remote, whether you're hybrid, whether you're in person. And that is continuing despite the changing conditions. Anything else you guys can think of that's important?
Yeah, I would just say the other piece is tracking students' progress and trying to make sure that you've thought through how are we going to monitor the students' progress and engagement, so that if there is a challenge later, you can have some data to look at and say the student was engaging, was progressing with their skills, you know, the services we were providing were meaningful. And that's obviously a challenge in this situation, but I think figuring out ways to collect that data is critical. Okay, the second point we have up here is in-person instruction, and we get questions about this in a couple different buckets, I would say. And the first one starts with the ISB guidance that came out, I think, this summer. saying that districts should prioritize getting students with special needs into the building for in-person instruction. And that's created, I think, some confusion. I think it is well-intentioned and in a good plan to get kids in first, because those students obviously oftentimes are struggling more with remote, and you do have this additional legal obligation towards those students. Logistically, trying to figure out how do you get these kids in, who is going to staff those classrooms, you know, how are they going to be grouped, how do we keep cohorts together when you have kids that are in an inclusive setting. It's really quite difficult, I think. And I think parents look at this guidance and say, this is my ticket, my kid gets to come to school. And that's not what it says, right? I mean, we're saying if the district is offering in-person instruction, if that is safe, we're gonna try our best to make sure we're getting our kids with IEPs in the door and trying to make sure we're meeting those needs. And that is, I think, really looking different across all the different districts that we work with. The other piece, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, is that we have to figure out ways to accommodate students who are unable to follow the safety protocols, and really thinking about how to make sure we're teaching those skills, right? Until now, wearing a mask, staying 6 feet apart of other people was not part of going to school. And we have to teach kids how to comply with those pieces. Let me go on to some of the other questions we've been getting about in-person that Jennifer, maybe you can address.
Sure. So first would be the request for in-person service. Let's say you're remote entirely as a district, but we've gotten assisted our clients with many requests where a parent of a special ed student says, this does not work for my child, period. We need in-person services. So how I would counsel is, if you've made a district decision that in-person is not safe, the IEP process will not supersede that. So that decision that in-person isn't safe applies to special education students, even though we know that it's a priority to get them in. But again, we've decided it's not safe for the entire building. But there's a second step, I think, when you get that can't be the end of the discussion, is just, no, you can't have in person. It needs to dig in a little bit deeper. What isn't working at home? And let's try to troubleshoot those issues, and probably requires an IEP meeting, or at least documentation of communication and troubleshooting around those issues. So I would treat it as, even if they're not asking for a meeting, if you're not able to troubleshoot, then this would be a good point to start doing meetings with the parents, with the team, to try to address the specific issues of frustration. Whether you're going to have, I mean, you may agree that, I mean, the student really struggles remotely and there's not a lot else we can do, but I think more often than not, what I've heard teams come up with are additional things that can be attempted. And so I do think those are worthwhile, not just from a legal liability perspective, but from a practical perspective. Your teams do seem to have some solutions. The second is request for in-home services. We are not recommending that you agree to that whatsoever. If you've decided in-person is not safe and you're remote as a district, doubly so, you cannot guarantee any of the safety protocols are being implemented in someone's home. And so that is even more off the table, you know, whereas you may consider some in-person, you know, you're gonna maybe trial some groups in person in your building. Sometimes you get to that point, but in-home, you know, I would put that pretty far down the list of interventions I would recommend. The last point we have here is opt-in, opt-out. As we come up on second semester, many districts did ask parents to make decisions one semester at a time. So going back to the parents, communicating again what decision it is they're making. So, and for what time period they're making it. Have some, you know, explain what the protocols will be, what the staffing will be. I've certainly heard a lot of frustration and pushback from parents who felt that they were making a decision into something that was going to, you know, into a remote program that would maybe be more synchronous and have more support, and then finding out that that was not the case, and then that's where conflicts arose. So I think the more communicating we can do right now, where we're back to that point where parents are going to be deciding, here's this decision you're making, and we are going to hold you to that for maybe the semester, because staffing wise, that's just a necessary piece.
Yeah, and I saw we have a question come in. We've been stressing the communication with parents, and a question that we've had numerous families they have not been able to connect with. They've tried phone calls, texts, emails, home visits, mailing. What next? Dana, do you have ideas on that?
Yeah, you know, I think that's sort of the other side to this coin, is we have parents that are communicating with us continuously and complaining, but it's also, it's important to reach out to everyone, number one, and then you have concerns about parents who aren't engaging or aren't responding. And I think, or about students who aren't engaging or aren't responding. And I think the parent not engaging and not responding, the way to address that problem is just to make sure that you have a record of all the communications that you've sent, and you're keeping that record going forward. So if you've sent an email to parent that says, here's our proposed remote learning plan, if you are unsatisfied with any way, this is the person you should contact. We can have an IEP meeting. You know, otherwise we are going to implement this at any time when we transition back to remote. Or, you know, likewise for a blended learning plan. As long as you have a communication of that type out there to parents and you've kept the record, you know, I think then you have done your duty. And even if they're not engaging back with you, you can defend any claims that are coming back. I think the larger problem is for the kids that aren't participating and the parents that aren't participating, you know, because as the kids don't participate, the comp ed issues are probably, you know, becoming exacerbated and growing because we've just had someone that drops off. And in those cases, I do think you need to, you know, employ the other resources that you may have in the school, whether that's, you know, a team that goes out to check on people, that does well visits, whether that's partnership with a community organization, and then documenting all the attempts you've made to get the student engaged and the family back re-engaged. But if the student's engaging and the parent's just not engaging, just having a record is going to provide you with that protection.
Yeah, I was talking to a district yesterday about a parent who wasn't responding to requests for IEP meeting, and the annual review date is coming. I mean, remembering that you can hold IEP meetings without parent participation if the standards, like if you cannot convince them to participate, and we prove that through communication. We often look for three documented attempts at least. It's kind of reasonable under the circumstances, but we want to see documented attempts where you tried to get the parent to come to an IEP meeting. If they didn't respond whatsoever, I mean, in some ways it's easier than the parent who doesn't respond, and then 5 minutes before the meeting, they ask you to reschedule. That's actually what drives me even more crazy in a way. But for the parents who never respond, but yet their child's still enrolling, you're still responsible. Do not blow those deadlines. Do hold meetings. You can then send the IEP, and if the parent asks to reconvene later and it gives a reason, so be it, you reconvene, but at least you're compliant on the annual review or whatever meeting it needs to be held.
Great. We also have another question about in-person services. What is the best response from the district to a private therapeutic school who said it's okay for their staff to provide OT and PT in the home? Do we have concerns about therapeutic schools doing that?
So we really can't, I mean, I think we have to start with the fact that we really can't control what the therapeutic school is going to do or how they're going to run their staff. And I think certainly this does make it difficult for public educators, because therapeutic schools and frankly private providers are providing services in many cases where public schools are not. But they operate, I mean, I think you have to explain to parents, you're not going to be able to get the therapeutic day school to just stop doing what it's doing. I mean, you can have a discussion with them, you can partner with them to the extent that you work with them on individual student plans, you can try to work that out. But I think the real response has to go to the parents of the students who are coming to you and probably saying, you know, this therapeutic day school is sending an OT to my house. Why aren't I getting one? And I think it goes back to the district is serving a lot of people, and it has a mandate to serve all those people, and it has a liability insurance that's different. There are responsibilities to the public that are different. It has ties with the Illinois State Board of Education and other agencies in Illinois that are different than a private company would have. And so it's just a separate matter. And I think you just have to have empathy for the parents' frustration, but just explain that that's not the standard that's going to be in place here.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about paraprofessional support. Dana, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about what is that even supposed to look like when we're remote?
Right, and I think that's a very good, important consideration for the team to be considering in this remote learning plan or a blended learning plan is really what is the purpose of the one-to-one support when you're in school, and how, whether or not that one-to-one support or that purpose can be achieved when the student is at home. And you may find that the remote program does not require one-to-one support in the same way as the in-school program, because maybe the participation has changed and the way the services are provided, the student isn't interacting as much. Like the student's not going to a big gym where they could wander off, or they could, you know, the activities have been changed in such a way that that's not needed. Conversely, you could have kids that maybe didn't need a one-to-one aid or didn't need a check-in with an individual service provider, and now all of a sudden they're at home, it's remote, they need it because the way they're functioning is just totally different. And we've heard this, like I've heard from parents' attorneys, it's so fascinating. Mickey was saying, you know, I have probably a good chunk of kids on my caseload that are doing better than they have ever done. They are just more functional. And it may be that being remote and doing things sort of at their own pace was a godsend for them based on what their disability is or how they were presenting in school, but others are going to need different things. So it is just going to be different, and we have to be ready for that.
Yeah, for sure. We've heard definitely that, you know, logging on to multiple classes throughout the day and schedules that change, you know, following all the different links is hard. Just the executive functioning piece is, the demands are higher for a lot of these kids. And so they may need additional check-ins and additional support provided remotely from somebody who's like a paraprofessional or aide type support. Okay, Jennifer, do you want to talk to us a little bit about our safety protocols with masks and close contacts?
Yes, and we just got a question in the chat that I think exactly illustrates the point I wanted to talk about, which is the chat, if everyone looks at it, is, I know you will touch on this issue, but we have parents who are insistent that wearing masks interferes with instruction due to sensory issues. Our teachers are very nervous, and we have already had one of them who turned up positive, and we had to quarantine all the teachers and students due to that. So I think that's exactly the balance. And so we still have guidance from IDPH and ISB that says just because a student can't wear a mask is not in and of itself a reason to exclude a student from school. That we can't just exclude for that. But we then have the interactive process that's always necessary in determining accommodations. So now we have a need, a student who can't wear a mask. How else are we going to keep that student and other students safe? And we know that shields are not as safe, and we know other things, you know, are not as protective. I think what we are sometimes seeing now is that some of our special ed programs are being, you know, we're having greater spread there. This week, I've gotten more questions about adaptive pauses just for special ed programs, because they're seeing that's, you know, that's really where they're getting infections. And that's where the staffing, when we don't have staff to staff those rooms, you really can't keep them in person. So it really, on one hand, you know, parents might say the instruction is not as effective with the mask. I mean, I'm not going to disagree with that, but what's also not effective is needing to stop in person altogether because you start to get positive cases. And we are seeing that where the guidance is held, where masks are worn, where there's social distance, it's much less disruptive if there is a positive case. So, you know, I don't have perfect solutions, but I would say even to those parents in response, it's in order to support continued instruction that we're so concerned about these safety protocols. Because again, if there's a positive case and we haven't maintained distance and we haven't maintained masks, you will be considered more, there will be more close contacts and more people will be quarantined, and it will be more disruptive when there's a positive case. And I think just about everywhere is experiencing that right now. So again, I guess the bottom line here is you can't automatically exclude because of masks, but we're going to take that take a very close look at what could be done as an alternative to keep safe. And really it's alternative PPE and distance. And if those aren't suffice, then we look at the distance of remote learning and other ways of isolating and keeping students safe. I don't know if you guys have had any similar or wanted to comment on this one.
I think that covers a lot of it. You know, for kids with sensory issues, you know, if they need a mask break and they can, you know, take a walk outside onto the playground for a few minutes and take the mask off while they're outside. You know, I think that problem solving piece, the team's just going to have to keep working through issues in order to help the student be able to participate in a way that's safe for everybody.
Right. And I saw something else in the chat about creative solutions, about adapting the mask, sort of working with it to make it the most comfortable it can be for the student. And that's absolutely appropriate. But I think the other thing you have to tell parents, I mean, this really is a health and safety issue right now. I think everyone thinks like, oh, this is just something that's, it's not going to be an optional thing. I mean, it doesn't look like this is ending like in the next few weeks, unfortunately. And, you know, just because you have sensory issues doesn't mean you don't have to wear a seatbelt, that you can like, you know, ride in the car with your head hanging out the window like a golden retriever, because that's how you like to do it. There's just certain things that are safety issues that I think we have to reiterate for parents. Like, this is not like you being at home and you deciding. We are deciding for everyone what is the best and the safest way. And I think, you know, to most parents, being in school with a mask and having instruction maybe be a little bit impacted by that is better than being home for weeks because we've had to quarantine, you know. So just sort of really putting those up next to each other. Which one are you going to choose?
Okay, moving on to a slightly different topic. I know you guys are all aware that last spring ISB put through the final regulations related to physical restraint and timeout. They are slightly different than all the different iterations that we had seen over the course of the last year with the various emergency rules and proposed rules. So you do want to familiarize yourself with the new regulations and make sure that your procedures are up to date, because those need to be aligned with the regulations. One of the big lifts that's coming up is that 8 hours of training annually are now required for people who are going to be involved in implementing a timeout or a physical restraint. The ISB guidance says they expect those 8 hours to be done by December 31st. And they have given the flexibility that can be done mostly remotely, except for the training about actually how to do the physical restraint and the practice of those positions, that needs to be done in person. And I would say for districts who are, you know, remote or mostly remote, teachers who are remote, I'm less concerned about you hitting the December 31st deadline, and most concerned about if you're going to be coming into a situation where a staff member may need to use a hold, that staff member has had their full complete training within the last year. So if you're not in person right now, then I'm not as concerned about you getting this done. When you're getting ready to go back into person, the training, you know, the preparation, the planning days used for that should include finishing up this training to make sure that staff are prepared to handle these situations safely. The other piece, and this is something we've gotten a lot of questions on, is, how do we do a physical restraint safely with COVID? And I think those are really hard questions, and really doubles down on the preparing for other positive interventions to help you avoid getting to the point where you're going to need to use a physical intervention. Because even with additional PPE, with all the training, that does obviously put people at increased risk. And so looking at those alternatives is especially important for the IEP team at this point. Jennifer and Dana, have you guys seen any creative solutions or other issues related to physical restraint and timeout?
No, I mean, just that I think you do get to a point where you consider an alternative placement or an assignment to remote learning if safety can't be maintained. So, if a student routinely needs physical restraint and no amount of PPE, the student's tearing off PPE and tearing it off staff and spitting at staff or whatever, again, these programs what we're seeing is these classrooms are getting shut down and staff are needing to quarantine, and we can't staff these programs anymore. So either you make some hard decision for individual students who just aren't able to be accommodated in person, or the entire program's going to get shut down. I mean, is what I feel like we're getting into that part of the year and getting to that part of the numbers where we're just seeing that start to happen a lot of places.
Yeah, I also think it's going to be interesting to see how remote learning impacts special ed generally. And when you have kids that are really out of control in a school setting and in an institutional setting, whether or not we're not going to see more remote learning and more, interventions that are done sort of in the way that we're talking to you now rather than in person, just as a method. Who knows, how kids are going to react to it. So I think that's just something interesting that I think as we go through this to see how that evolves.
Yeah, and I'll flag here, we talked about it last week, there is legislation pending in Illinois that would sort of codify some of the new definitions that are in the regulations. It would prohibit prone restraint and require districts to create plans to decrease the use of physical restraint and timeout. We understand veto session is not going to be happening in the next few weeks, so that's going to be on hold for a little while longer, but I don't think it's going away. And so we'll continue to watch for that. We maybe don't have the final version of all of our policies and procedures as it continues to change here. Okay, Dana, can you talk to us a little bit about labor issues?
So I'm sure many of the special educators out there, or a lot of them were like, labor issues, why do I need to know about that? It's kind of like our advertisement for our property tax session next week. Probably marketing to the wrong audience, but you are the right audience. We know what we're speak of here. As we have special ed teachers and special ed students prioritize for in-person learning, and as we see districts looking for ways to bring special ed kids in the classroom, but then also maintain special ed classrooms, even in periods where maybe regular ed kids are not receiving as much in-person instruction, labor issues are at the forefront. So just the sort of like nuts and bolts, like dummy guide to labor issues, not that anyone is dumb, I'm just referencing those yellow books that used to see all over. Just what are the required subjects of bargaining? You're not going to have to really worry about wages and hours, but working conditions is a biggie. And working conditions are mandatory subjects of bargaining. We've been doing a lot of work on this in the firm, and through our representation of CPS and our work at the labor board, we now know that safety is a working condition that must be bargained. Typically, when you bargain working conditions, you can bargain to impasse and then just impose whatever the board would like to have in place. But the recent decisions from the Illinois Educational Labor Relations Board have said that that is not the case in relation to COVID-19 and the risk of transmission of coronavirus to staff. So if you go to the next slide, some of the safety issues that are really going to be front and center for special education, the provision of special education are, you know, PPE, the classroom setup, hazard pay, workload issues, how safe it is. If teachers don't think it's safe, they can, you know, file a labor action, and until you get that resolved, you may be in a situation where you can't transition to being in person, or you might have to maintain the status quo until you work out those labor issues. So it's just something to be mindful of, and it can be a difficult thing to work through, but it's, you know, it's actually, I think special ed can be the model for labor issues, because we do work so closely with our service delivery people. Like special ed teachers and administrators, I think they have more of a bond than is typical with it, especially in bigger school districts. You really are on the front lines with them. So I think there's potential for you guys to learn some new things and really make some inroads in this area. But definitely something of concern. Anything else you guys want to share? I know this has been difficult for clients, and we're all sort of getting some questions about it.
And one issue that keeps coming up is special education teachers complaining if, because of that guidance to prioritize the return to special ed, that special education teachers feel that their work responsibilities are then disparate from their colleagues who are general education teachers and not prioritized to return. Dana kind of went through the aspects of that you do or don't need to bargain, and the policy decision that special ed is going to be prioritized, and the fact that not every teaching job is the same are going to remain true, but there are going to be aspects of that and impacts of that need to be bargained as you're looking at who stays remote, who goes in person, and that keeps ebbing and flowing.
Okay, moving on to evaluations. And I think at the beginning of this, you know, we kind of thought and hoped maybe we'll just kind of put a pause on this and we'll pick it up later when we come back in person. And obviously, as this continues on longer and longer, that's just not a realistic option. You know, we know that there's not any formal flexibility that's been given with respect to our timelines. And so we've got to be a little bit creative about how these evaluations get done. I do want to flag that IDEA specifically does require that we do assessments and use evaluation materials for the purposes that they're intended for, and in a way that is valid and reliable and in compliance with the instructions from the publisher. And so some of the publishers have put out additional guidance about how you can do this in a remote setting, or how you can adapt and what this looks like. And you've got to really kind of look at each individual assessment to see what can be done remotely versus what would have to be done in person. I think, you know, teams can be really creative about this and think about what do we really need in order to make decisions right now, and what can we put off and maybe do later that we don't need it for this particular decision. But I think, you know, initially we had thought we could just put a lot of this off to later, and that really later is too far away, I think. And so we've got to come up with solutions that are going to be workable right now. What have you guys seen?
I mean, I do think this is just, it just calls on creativity. And I know that sometimes that's a struggle, because I think people get very used to doing things in the way they've always done them. So I hear from administrators that say the psychologist says they just can't, or the speech path says they just can't. And I think you have to just keep thinking of how you possibly can, and like rely on your colleagues and share stories of how things have been done. And I know that this format is not ideal, but there are a lot of things that you can do with the screen that you might not think that you could have, but you can if you adapt a little bit. And I think we've seen people do some great things, and just sharing that out with your peers is very helpful.
I guess I would add two small points. One is that I would really caution against documenting that your team thinks what they did is inadequate. So I've seen a lot of, well, we would have done this and this and this if we were in person, but we couldn't do any of it. So we really don't have the information we need, but, and you know, then they go ahead and do the evaluation. I don't really think that's, I mean, on one hand, yes, you can document the constraints that were in place at the time you did it, but make sure you're not describing it. If you really think it's inadequate, go back and think of something else you can do to evaluate the student further. That's really not good documentation, and I think sets you up for some serious liability. So that would be one tip that I have seen. I think as our teams are frustrated with their constraints, them maybe venting a little bit in the notes of some of these documents. The other one that I just throw out there, just to be totally speculative, and I'm sure we'll have many, many more webinars on this, but I do wonder about some of the changes that may be ahead. Kendra emphasized that there's no formal flexibility now, and we don't really know how long COVID's going to last and how far into the new administration will be. But it certainly is something that could, as we know, COVID and schools specifically are going to be a priority of the new administration. I do wonder whether we might get some new guidance about flexibility and some of these points and timelines. That's one area I wouldn't be shocked to see more guidance on, and maybe a change in guidance with the change of administration. So just something to look out for. Not that I have any crystal ball whatsoever on that.
Yeah, we will absolutely be looking to see what happens next with that. Jennifer, can you talk a little bit about confidentiality?
Yes. So so first of all, HIPAA does not apply. Dana has said this in prior webinars. It's kind of an internal joke or inside joke now with us in our office, because we've all been asked many, many, many times if HIPAA applies, and they can't release something because of HIPAA. HIPAA does not apply to you whatsoever. Don't worry about complying with HIPAA. FERPA does apply, but does not in any way hinder remote learning. I'll put it that way. So you can Zoom away, do your classes, and that is not a violation of FERPA. I mean, just like you shouldn't in person, a teacher really should not be standing up and divulging confidential information about individual students to an entire class, whether they're on Zoom or not. So really, it's kind of the same common sense thoughts about not sharing confidential information during class. Don't do it when they're on Zoom. Don't do it when they're in person. But just instructing students or students' answers to prompts that you're doing or in-class work is not a student record, and it's not a violation for everyone to see that. Right. The other is notice, and this is one thing that I think our own thoughts have evolved from the very first days of the pandemic to now, which was, you know, going remote and doing things virtually was not certainly standard practice for especially some of these sensitive related services. Social work and counseling one-to-one on Zoom is a new thing. Now, consent is not required for that. Initially, I think in an abundance of caution, some of our clients were doing that, and we were even recommending that it might be a good idea for those, you know, very sensitive types. I think now what the live and learn on that is it was becoming a barrier to certain students receiving services. There are some parents who just don't respond, and I think we heard that on others, and unfortunately that was keeping students from services. Since consent's not required, you already have consent to provide special education generally, and it's not required specifically to do it remotely. We really, at this point, do not recommend that you require that additional consent and that you go ahead and provide services remotely or in person, as long as you have the special ed, obviously, consent to initial services. Anything you guys want to add on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think teachers are probably experiencing discomfort for good reason, is that they're not used to other people like walking by when they're delivering instruction. You know what I mean? I was a teacher for 8 years, you know, certainly if someone walks into your classroom, that does make a difference. It feels differently for the kids, it feels differently for the teacher. And for some teachers, that's sort of an anxiety inducing experience. you know, that being said, we haven't had, considering how long we've been doing this and how many, you know, conversations we had very few incidents of we've had some incidents, but very few of parents were really interfering or lurking, or, you know, I think the best advice is just to go about what you're doing and teach. And it isn't, teaching is not like a private act, even though we're not having people in the building all the time. It's, you know, telling somebody that their S sounds like a Z is not like the most confidential thing. It's not the same as reading from a social developmental history and saying, you know, you were late to be potty trained. That's not what we're doing. So since we're not doing those things, there's not as much concern.
Yeah, I think hopefully people are getting more comfortable with that as time goes on. I think that was something we had a lot of concerns about in the beginning, and we do still get some of these issues coming up, but as we do more and more of the online, people are getting more comfortable with that piece. Okay, the big gorilla in the room, comp ed. Dana, can you talk us through kind of what do we know so far? What should we be thinking about?
So we're expecting this to be a big issue. It has not been huge yet. I do see some cases, especially in the kids that are turning 22. So if you were really on full remote and you have some kids that are in your transition programs about to turn 22 and they're very close to getting out and they're very close to acquiring a skill, you might see some requests from parents just because it's just that's kind of the worst timing there is, because there just leaves you no time left in their experience in the public schools to sort of catch up. I think the other thing to keep in mind for comp ed is it's not hour for hour. I mean, even in those situations where a student is, you know, maybe remote for the last 3 months of their educational career, that doesn't mean they are entitled to 3 months of education after we're back in person, and that it has to be fully in person. It's not, it's if you lose this, you get this. It's really an evaluation of what progress you would have made, what we need to do to get you sort of back on track. And that's different for every student. So progress monitoring, having a gauge on where kids are performing, whether you're remote or not remote, and having a way to sort of move kids along, that's going to be the key things to preventing compensatory education. You know, that being said, some of these claims are going to be, they're going to come in no matter what, and we're just going to have to deal with them on that end.
Yeah, I think that's right. You've got some kids that, you know, this is just really hard, and, you know, remote is not working that well, and you can problem solve and keep data and do the best you can with that to minimize the potential for compensatory education. But there's going to be some that's just going to be part of this. We have seen recently in some other states trying to get ahead of it a little bit and distribute. I think Texas is for students that have more significant disabilities, kind of proactively doing a compensatory sort of amount of money that's being handed out for private services to sort of supplement what they're able to get remotely. Massachusetts, I think, maybe has a sort of similar program. All of that obviously is contingent on funding from either the state or the federal level, which obviously, you know, those are big hurdles. And so I think this is going to be a challenge, how we can do it if there's going to be a sort of systemic program or if each district is just going to have to case by case sort through these. Okay, residency, which is not necessarily what we thought we'd be concerned about. But now that kids are doing so much learning remotely, you know, where you're staying, if that's, you know, right here in Illinois, or if it's with grandma in Wisconsin, or, you know, someplace else, parents and families have a little more flexibility. What does that mean for us as far as residency and special education? I know you guys are familiar with the general, you know, if you start the year, you finish the year. You don't have to pay tuition. You can finish the year if you started the year as a resident. And typically, if a student moved to Texas in the middle of the year, they're not going to commute and continue going to your district. They're going to start going to school in Texas. And now we do see families saying, hey, it's going to be hard for the student to start in a new district. They don't know anybody. They don't know the teachers. We want them to continue remotely in the district that they're coming from. And I think that's a complicated issue because we do have this part of the school code, but we also have the FAPE obligation, which is to residents of the district. And the FAPE obligation follows that student. So if the student leaves the state, leaves the district, then that FAPE obligation goes to where the student is. Dana, we've also had questions, and I see we've got one in our Q&A about licensure for especially related service providers, our speech pathologists, our social workers. How should they be thinking about if there's a problem providing services to kids who are not currently in Illinois?
Let's address that, and let me go back to something else that we talked about earlier that I think we need to clear up a little bit. So I think the whole issue of licensure has been a cause of concern, and I think it really turns on whether or not the student has actually moved away. So student going to live with grandpa and grandma up in Wisconsin temporarily because mom and dad have jobs where they have to go to work every day, and the student is being educated remotely. That's not really a change in their residence that's going to have a licensure issue. There is an executive order from the governor that addresses this and addresses providing services remotely when patients are across state lines. You know, I think it's different if the student actually moves. And I think Kendra sort of touched on that. You know, if the student has moved and is no longer in the state or in a different district, that district has the obligation then to provide the student with FAPE. And you know, generally kids that receive related service from licensed service providers are special ed students. So those districts where they're currently residing should be providing those services. But if someone is just temporarily someplace else due to childcare reasons, that's not going to cause a licensure issue. I also want to go back and clarify something that I said, and I think I said it a little bit too bluntly. Right now, the labor issues on safety, that is not, although it is still a mandatory subject of bargaining, if you reach impasse on it, you still may have the option to just implement unilaterally. That's still an option, but it's risky in light of these recent rulings and in light of the difficulty of determining what impasse actually is. So I just wanted to clarify that in case anyone didn't want to give anyone the wrong impression.
Okay, Jennifer, can you talk to us about mandatory COVID testing?
Yes, so we are seeing many more districts exploring this right now. We're getting to a point where there's some actual options where school districts could offer the spit test. So the test, you spit into a tube, you get a response within, you know, half a day or a few hours on whether the person who spit into that tube is positive. And some districts want to do that as a screening tool to reduce spread. What I think they're hearing from the medical experts is that is, you really need a critical mass of people participating in order for it to be worthwhile. So then the question is that we're getting, the legal question is, can you mandate that testing for staff and for students? And it's not a simple answer exactly. There are risks associated and issues to consider. So any district wanting to do this should really reach out and look at their particular circumstances and what protocols they're willing to establish, what risks they're willing to take. I will say there is authority in the school code. And believe it or not, Kendra actually had the pleasure of reading 100-old decisions from our last pandemic that do give us reason. Usually, Kendra and I do not rely on 100-year-old decisions in making our legal opinions, but in this particular case, they're actually very insightful and relevant. So there is authority that we think school districts do have a legal basis for doing this, but there's many nuances. So I don't want to give too flip an answer on this one for sure, but this is something you could definitely consider, but know that you need to get into the weeds. This is not a an easy lift, but something definitely worth considering.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that was our top 10. I do want to remind you guys that we have our blog. The website is right there. We've been posting updates throughout the pandemic and, you know, before that as well. So some of the topics are things other than COVID. So we encourage you to check that out. So let's see if there are any other questions here. I think we got anything. Any final thoughts from Dana or Jennifer?
You know, I go back to, I think the main theme of this is communication with parents and communications with staff. Like everybody's got to be on the same page all the time. You've got to share information transparently, and it's a lot of work. There's no way around it. It's going to be a lot of work, and we understand how hard you guys are all working, and you know, we appreciate that. I think on behalf of our own kids and behalf of kids everywhere, it's challenging. And all we can do is just keep on plugging and keep on plugging away at it.
Yeah, I mean, on the slightly optimistic note, I'm surprised we haven't had more terrible issues come up. I mean, as far as from a legal, I would say most of you are working with families very well, and that, you know, everyone is dealing with the situation and being practical. And you know, I could think of a lot of terrible situations one could get into, but honestly, for the most part, I've seen districts being able to work through issues with families. I've been so impressed. And so, you know, there are a lot of issues. I mean, we just went through 10, but I really think people are managing surprisingly well.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again next week.
Take care.